Okay, we are now at the point where the two kingdoms are going to separate, right where the star is at about 930 BC. Just so you get your bearings, they're going to become two nations, but for a good deal of time, it will be a civil war among the Israelites trying to come to a conclusion as to who is going to rule. And the main characters are three people. You can see up here that this thing was working a minute ago, and then when they did that thing, it doesn't work anymore. Okay. Anyway, Solomon is the last king and the most glorious king of the United Kingdom. He was, as you studied with Len, he was incredibly wealthy, incredibly wise. He was famous around the world of that day and considered among the wisest. We'll talk about that for a second. And then Rehoboam, his son, is the crown prince, and he is the one who will reign after him. And then we have Jeroboam, who is the rebel that leads 10 of the tribes away from Rehoboam, and they secede in a violent upheaval, which leads them to war for years and years. The passages that we are going to be dealing with are in both First Kings and Second Chronicles. So you might want to put a marker in First Kings 11 and 12 and Second Chronicles 10 if you want to flip back and forth, because the story is carried in both places and you get different details in one place or another. And understand how this all comes about. You have to ask yourself the question, how in the world could such a successful, powerful, rich, prosperous kingdom in a matter of days fall apart? Who knows how that possibly could happen? I already did this. We got this will work. It just won't work with this pointer. Sorry. Yeah, that worked. How could that possibly happen? And the way to understand a little bit, just to sort of get ourselves started, is the Queen of Sheba. We all know this story. It's what really gives us a focus on Solomon's wealth. She comes to his kingdom. Let's just read 1 Kings 10, 1 and 2.
When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relation to the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind.
Now, Sheba is the area between Yemen and Ethiopia, and they straddle the Straits of Tiran, which is the mouth of the Red Sea. And if you have the toll booth at the mouth of the Red Sea, you are very, very powerful and very rich. And I just have a feeling from what I read here that the Queen of Sheba was, she was going to show this upstart young nation who really a great king or government was. She's coming with hard questions. She's going to stump him. She's coming with his caravan of riches. You think you're rich? Let me show you what I'm going to give you all this stuff, right? And it says in verse 5 that when the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, the burnt offerings he made at the table, she was overwhelmed. And the King James translate, there was no more spirit in her. That's how great this kingdom was. And the rest of the chapter 10, that's the chapter that tells you about how rich Solomon was. And you could say that absolutely nothing looked more solid than that. And to have this kingdom break up was as much of a surprise to them as 9/11 was to us. There was rot in the kingdom. There was trouble on the horizon, and nobody was ready for it. Now, the division of the kingdom was locked in stone already, long before Solomon died and left it to his son. Now, it wasn't obvious, okay, but we are told that Solomon was warned. And we don't even know if Rehoboam knew about it. Now, you remember back at the outset of his reign, God appears to Solomon, right? One of three appearances. And he asks him, it's a wonderful story. The genie comes out of the bottle, I'll give you 3 wishes. Well, God gave him one. He said, what would you like? And I'll give it to you. And Solomon wisely said, I need wisdom to govern your people. God said, God bless you. I will not only give you wisdom, I'll give you riches and power and glory. And he did. And Solomon became a great king. But then he also gave him a warning. And he said, but to be this, you must walk in my ways, keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked. Remember last week, we said that the benchmark is David, the man after God's own heart. He walked faithfully with God, not perfectly, but he walked faithfully in obedience to God's laws and commands. So that's a conditional aspect of this. Now, fast forward 20 years later. It took him about 20 years to build the palace of the forest of Lebanon, which was his palace, and the temple to the Lord, which was the great temple of Solomon. And at the end of 20 years, he's there dedicating the temple, and the Lord appears to him a second time. And the second time, he gives him the same promise, but the emphasis is a little bit different. Jack, let's read 1 Kings 9, 6-8, stopping at rubble.
But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among the peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble.
Wow. Now he's emphasizing a warning, isn't he? He's given him a warning. He's watched Solomon as he built these things and he began to become grand and great. And he says, watch out, Solomon. Watch out. What I've given you can be taken away. And later on, years later on, even in the time of the Romans, with the second temple, the Israelites thought God would never allow this temple to go away because we have God's temple. We are God's people. We are the ones that God favors. And he says, if you don't obey, you don't live according to my rules and statutes, then this could become another heap of rubble. And it in fact did. And I would say that no king or ruler before or after Solomon had as much going for him. God visited him a total of 3 times, gave him this promise of success. Solomon, you're going to be rich, you're going to be famous, you're going to be wise. All you got to do is obey me. Have no other gods before me. And isn't that what God tells us? I mean, apart from the issue of our salvation and forgiveness of sins, which is all about atonement, he said, do you want a good life? I only gave you 10 rules. Just obey them. Best you can. Follow after me. And yet he lets it slip all away. So 10 is the height of Solomon's kingdom. 11 tells you where it begins to fall apart. It's the turning point that in the narrative that puts his kingdom on trajectory for decline and fracture. And it all has to do with the women in his life. Isn't it so, guys?
Hey.
I know.
I don't know what you're talking.
Good man, Don.
Well, let's explore that a little bit. 1 Kings 11, 1 and 2.
King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love.
Held fast to them in love. What? Wait a minute. I wouldn't have expected that word love. I mean, in those days, and marriages at that level are all about diplomacy. In fact, his first wife was the daughter of Pharaoh, and that's what kept Pharaoh at bay, beside the fact that he was a little weak. All right. But that kept him protected on his southern flank. And that's, of course, something that Rehoboam didn't understand and didn't protect his southern flank with an alliance, and Rehoboam ended up getting invaded. But even after that, he loved many women. I think the problem is that he had a problem with lust and romance. Lust and romance. Now, when you're that rich, and that's smart, and you're that well known, and everybody thinks you're the world, the groupies come after you. And if he could take his pick and have any woman he wanted, he had the power to do it. In those days, you wanted a woman, you just took her. Okay. But I think he actually loved them. I think he actually cared. He loved beauty. He loved the loveliness of women, and he was easily to fall. He found it easy to fall in love. And of course, he had the means to indulge his problem, didn't he? Because all he had to do was add her to his harem. You come on, I'll marry you, right? I'll marry you, because obviously he could marry a lot of them. And it says that he married over 1,000 wives. Wow. Now, how do you love 1,000? One at a time. One at a time. And you see, I think that's what he did. I think every time he saw another woman that was beautiful, he fell for her. And he brought into his harem all these women from foreign lands in contradiction to God's specific command. Lynn.
Mark, some of those were also political alliances. It says,
Yeah.
I think it says about 300 were of royal heritage. And so those were obviously political alliances for
Yeah.
Solomon.
Yeah, but there would have been politics to it too, as well. Yep.
And I was just looking it up. I was curious what the word was love there, and it's Ahab, A-H-A-B, and it says to love like to be a friend, to be a lover, an ally, familial love. And it could be romantic as well, but
Sure. Yeah. So I think he had a weak spot here. And he certainly was led into sin because he disobeyed the Lord. He disobeyed the Lord, didn't he? Does sin come easier when we have the resources to deal with the consequences? Oh, yeah. When you're rich, you can deal with a lot of these things. We see that among our movie stars and our politicians, don't we? Now, what's the issue with God? Is it polygamy? Shame on you for marrying many, many wives. You know, the Bible does not specifically condemn polygamy, although it's contrary to God's purpose. God's purpose when he established marriage and creation was one man, one woman, one lifetime. But God doesn't make a big deal. He figures polygamy is its own punishment. You want to bring a lot of women into your life? Good luck with that. Or do you, a woman, want to join up with a team of women that are sharing the same guy? Good luck with that. God lets that go. And it's not really about polygamy. The ones he did marry did turn his heart as God had warned him. Chapter 11, verse 4 again.
As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been.
We're back to the heart again, aren't we? You see, a familial relationship, even with 1,000 of them, it will draw you away from God. And I think the warning is the danger of being married to an unbelieving spouse. When my children are dating somebody or getting interested in somebody, it looks like this may go somewhere. What's the first question I've got? Do they know the Lord Jesus Christ? Not just are they mouthing the words. And there's a lot of guys that'll mouth the words and tell you what you want to hear. Okay? Just to get the girl. And I have taught young marrieds for ever and ever, for years and years. And I've seen many women come back to the church bruised because they have not had a fellowship with an unbelieving husband who said, well, I'm going to go to your church. I'll go to your church. I think the issue is the effect that an unbelieving spouse has by coming between a man or a woman and the Lord. What's the first commandment? No other gods before me. That's the most important one. He is primary. So this is not a lesson so much about disobedience. It's not even a lesson so much about women. I think that this is a lesson about guarding our weak spot. And we've all got it. We've all got one. Matthew Henry says this when he talks about this. He says, let us watch and be sober, for ours is a dangerous warfare, and we're in enemy country, and our worst foes are the traitors of our own hearts. Good point, isn't it? Alvin, you had something to say?
In Deuteronomy 17. Verse 17 says, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away.
That's right.
So it was a rule, it was a charge from God that he not do it. So he was disobedient.
Well, he was disobedient by marrying people that were not faithful to the Lord. Okay. And I think what he's saying there is true. You know, yeah, God is against polygamy, but he doesn't make a big issue out of polygamy. That's my point there. Anyway, let's go on. It's about guarding our weak spot. It also tells us that sin is a progressive disease. Now, why do I say that? Well, look where he ended up. Okay. Come on, we got this thing going. Yeah, here we are. Later on, for the third time, God appears to him. Chapter 11, 11 to 13.
So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen.
Wow. He says, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant, but I won't do it in your life. I'm going to do it in your son's life. Do you think Solomon told his son, guess what, Rehoboam? Got bad news for you. God just told me that you're going to lose your kingdom. I don't think he did. I'm not even sure he thought much of it. Terry.
It was nice to hear that Solomon said, oh Lord, I'm so sorry. I know I've done this and I repent of it all, and please. But I don't see any of that here.
No, I don't see it either. I don't see it. He doesn't show repentance. Or like David repented after the affair with Bathsheba and Uriah. And later on, it actually states that you're not following the Lord as David did, who was faithful in all things except the matter of Uriah. Okay, you're right. No repentance at all. Now, he gets this bad news. Now, how do you think he felt? There's a story of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is brought a big revival to Israel. He's a great king. He's done a lot of good things. And he has gotten ill. And he begs God to give him more years. And God says, okay, I'm going to make you well. You got 15 more years. And so after that, it so happens that there's an envoy from Babylon. Now, what do we know about Babylon as far as the future goes? They're going to conquer Israel. They're going to destroy the city and carry everybody off into captivity. But he doesn't know this. And so this envoy comes from this wicked city, and they come to visit him. And he says, well, let me show you. Let me show you around. And he shows him all the riches that he had put together, quite a bit, and basically gave them this big temptation to come take it. And interesting enough, God says that I will judge you for doing this in 2 Kings chapter 20, verses 17 to 19.
The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, that will be born to you will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. The word of the Lord you have spoken is good, Hezekiah replied, for he thought, will there not be peace and security in my lifetime?
Is that despicable? Yeah, it is. I think Solomon must have felt that way. And I think we are tempted to feel that way. Most of us are older. Like my friend Bobby Smith says, I'm glad I'm on the way out and not on the way up. Francis Schaeffer said years and years ago that in this age, as America declined, the most important thing to the church, to the people in the church, will be personal peace and affluence. just as long as I can enjoy my nice vacations, my beautiful house, my good car, as long as I have lots of friends and we get together on Friday nights, that's all I want. Don't bother me with all the big issues, the forsaking of God that's going on all around us, the evil that we see. I just want to be left alone. Personal peace, affluence. Glad it's not going to happen in my time, he says. So he's like Hezekiah, and sometimes I think he's like us. What is the deal? Yeah, seriously, we couldn't get the pointer to work before. Okay. So now we're going to be introduced. We're done with Solomon. We're going to be introduced to Solomon's successor, who is his crown prince son. His name is Rehoboam. I want to go through this fairly quickly. 1 Kings 11, 42 to 43.
Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king.
Now let's just do a little character study of him. Rehoboam is a young man, or he's actually 40 when he takes the throne. He's been raised all his life in the richest nation on earth. He has his father is known to be the wisest man in the world. Everybody comes to see him, to ask him questions, to gain his counsel, and he is the crown prince who's going to inherit it all. He's a child of privilege, and so he's accustomed to power, and that leads to a lot of pride and arrogance, I would expect. So I paint a picture of him from all this. I'd say he's probably a proud man. He's certainly accustomed to wealth, enormous wealth. It says that Solomon made silver like the stones in the street. And he had an unprecedented wealth. But I think the important thing is he was exposed to many religions. He was religiously ambivalent. It says in a couple places, he did not set his heart on following the Lord of Israel. And the reason for that was his mother was an Ammonite. Now, it says in 3 places that his mother, Naamah, was an Ammonite. It's given us, and it says his mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. It says that 3 times. It's significant. Why is that? Who is the god of Ammon? By the way, where is Ammon? Well, I'll tell you. Ammon is to the east of the Jordan River. It's one of the 2 countries, Moab and Ammon, that came out of Lot's family. Okay, they were almost always enemies of Israel, but not quite always. David sequestered his parents from Saul over there in Moab. So Ruth was from Moab, but Ammon and Moab were foreign countries, and the god of Ammon was Molech. How many of you know anything about Molech? What do you think of when you say that? Sacrifice your children. Oh. Right? Now, the Bible refers to these as disgusting religions for their sexual license, for their violence, for their spiritism, devil worship, and things like that, but especially for killing their children. So that was his mother. Now he's this polygamous family. So in a polygamous family, you are raised by your mother. You're much closer to your mother than you are to your father. You hardly ever see your dad, right? And so she must have had a strong influence on him. Now, he's the crown prince. He's David's grandson. He's Solomon's son. He's going to go to Solomon's temple. He's going to attend the festivals. He's going to do all the things you got to do to be a good Israelite. But he also probably tolerates a little bit of Ammonite worship, right? He's pretty ambivalent about religious things. And he rejects the Lord. Later on, we see it says that when he became established, he abandoned the law of the Lord. Why do we do that? Is child sacrifice that much more attractive? I don't understand that.
You're not drowned, would you slip a lot easier?
Maybe. I think it's just something about the nature of us, of mankind. We are not born to go, we're not tending to go to the Lord. We're tended to go away from him. Jack.
We have a president that says if the Democrats win, his first order of business will be to sacrifice the babies.
That's right. Yeah, Terry.
The CDC just recommended that they put this vaccine, which is totally not recommended for children, in the school vaccine schedule. That's going to sacrifice the children. They already know that 30% of children who get this shot get myocarditis.
Many years ago, I was teaching, doing a lesson, and I was talking to my son, Chris, and Chris said to me, he said, Dad, I said, how awful it was that they sacrificed children, and children were really treated poorly in these times, in these ancient times. And he says, Dad, they're treated worse right now. He says, you go to any news front page on the web, and you count how many articles are about things that are done to or about children. I said, no. He said, go ahead, do it. And I went, it's been a week. I took the news feeds from several places that I wrote down how many were about. I was astounded. Yeah. So anyway, it's certainly about human nature. We tend to wander from the Lord, and we tend to wander towards evil. That's the one thing we deny is true, but it is. It's original sin. Is there a lesson about legacy here? I think there is. Because Rehoboam was what he was in part because of what his dad did that disobeyed the Lord. That's sobering, isn't it? That's sobering. The things we do have ripples all the way out. It doesn't say in the Bible that God punishes the children for the sins of the fathers, but he visits the sins of the fathers on the children. The alcoholic father leaves scars on his children. The divorced parents leave scars on those children. And those children are more likely to go through the same thing. So he was also highly educated. I want to move on quickly with this. It says in Ecclesiastes 1:13 and 14 that his father sought wisdom and knowledge. Go ahead, Jack. Go ahead, Ecclesiastes 1:13 and 14.
I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
This is a danger of acquiring knowledge apart from the fear of the Lord. When I was a little boy, I had to take these little alphabet noodles. Remember those little things? And I had to glue them into a saying. The school said, you just put a proverb or a saying on there. Wasn't supposed to be biblical. I said, well, what do you think I should do? And my dad said, write down the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I thought, that's not silly. But I did it. I wrote it down. I've never forgotten that. I think that's really true. Because you can get all the knowledge in the world, and we've got people who are chock full of knowledge, brains like crazy, smart as can be, and they're fooled because their knowledge is not based on the truth, which is the word of God. So I think that he's highly educated, but because of that, and because of the way he was educated, he becomes jaded and cynical. His father's opening statement in Ecclesiastes is meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. Becomes nihilistic. I think that means he's also amoral or immoral because he's got no reason to restrain his appetites. He's always had nobody say no to him. There's no reason to do anything. He doesn't fear God. And then I think he's also willful and arrogant. And that willfulness is what is going to be his undoing. Now, it's time Solomon dies. Rehoboam is going to be crowned. Now, what do you think that the coronation of King Charles III in Britain is going to be like? Huge, right? I mean, his wedding to Diana was amazing. But this will be a huge deal. This is something you plan for a long time. It's something that's just going to involve the entire nation. Well, that's what was going to happen. And they all headed up to Shechem, one of the oldest cities in Israel, one of the most important cities in the center of the country. 1 Kings 11:42 to 43.
I'm not there. Hang on.
Did I miss you with something?
First Kings 11:42 and 43.
Mhm.
Okay. I'm there.
Oh, no, I'm giving you the wrong one. I'm sorry.
Oh.
It's 12:1 and 2. Forgive me.
That's okay. All right. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from the king Solomon. He returned from Egypt.
Oh, now that's interesting. We've got this big to-do planned in Shechem, a major city in the nation. It's going to be a huge celebration of the coronation of the next king. the successor to Solomon. And with all Solomon's money and all of his fame, you can bet there were foreign dignitaries, there were representatives from all the tribes, there was a giant assembly, there were big parties, there were all kinds of deals going on, okay? And then it tells us this guy Jeroboam has been in Egypt and he comes up. Now, how did he get to Egypt? Well, let's go in to talk about it. He's a new character in the game. Jeroboam. We're told the story of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who rebelled against Solomon, but we're not told exactly how he rebelled. And it's in 1 Kings 11, 26 to 28, and then read 40. Okay.
Also, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeredah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. To 28. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David, his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. And then skipping to 40, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, to Shishak, the king, and stayed there until Solomon's death.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, this is a different kind of a character. We had Rehoboam, a child of privilege, arrogant, willful, powerful, never expected anybody to say no to him. And we had this guy Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam's different. He's the child of a single mother. Mother's a widow. Comes from a little bitty town. He's poor. And he's self-made. It says he is a young man and he is a man of standing. Now, that's a term of art that's used. Remember when we studied in Ruth, Boaz is a man of standing. And a man of standing means he's a person who's powerful, got influence, or maybe he's militarily powerful. He's capable, he's important, he's wealthy. The nation often goes to men of standing for levies in order to buy off foreign kings. So he's a man who's self-made. He's an influential kind of a guy. He was elevated by Solomon to be the head of a major portion of the labor force. Now, that would be the sons of Joseph. Ephraim and Manasseh were by far the largest tribes, and Solomon funded his big public works projects by drafting from every tribe people. You have to go serve, let's say, 2 years. Okay, you got to go serve in the labor gangs for 2 years. And then he took all the Canaanite cities and he made their men all slaves. And according to the Second Kings or Second Chronicles, it apparently is that there's over 150,000 of these people just working on the temple. And now his projects have been expanded all over the country, and he's working on the biggest project, which is the reinforcement of the defenses of Jerusalem. And he's been put in charge of all those people. Pretty good for a young guy coming up from nowhere. So he's a different kind of man. He's influential with the people. It's like a union boss. You do what he says. But I also think he's popular. He's a populist. We see later on that he takes the people's case to the king, and he says, give us a break. The work is too hard. The harsh labor, the hard taxes. We want some relief. And I think he was an activist. He's probably fiery, driven, type A guy. He's got a lot of charisma. He's unlike any other king of all the Israelites to come up like this from obscurity. And so it got so bad. We don't know exactly what he did. Maybe he led walkouts. Maybe he had demonstrations. Perhaps he gave fiery speeches, and Solomon saw him as a threat. And he tried to kill him. He escapes to Egypt. He becomes a fugitive. Now, I think as he's fleeing, perhaps, maybe before then, but I think it's as he's fleeing, he's accosted on the way by a fellow who is called a prophet of Shiloh named Ahijah. And it's 11:29.
About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country.
Now, this Shiloh, what do we know Shiloh for?
The ark.
the Ark had come for a while, 120 years before. It was where Moses and Joshua put the tabernacle after they came from Mount Sinai. And it stayed there all during the time of the judges. It was, can you imagine a 400-year-old tent made of animal skins and cloth, and had candles burning 24 hours a day inside and burning incense? That must have been a musty old place. But that all the worship was there. And Samuel began in the tabernacle. There was no temple in Samuel's day. And then you remember in Eli's day, the ark was taken out into battle by the Israelites, like pagan nations would take their gods and they'd carry them into the battle. And they took the ark and they lost. And then Philistines had the ark. But then the Philistines also swept over Israel, destroying their cities and burned down the tabernacle. That's where the tabernacle wound up. And the priests fled to other places and they tried to set up shop. But the ark remained with Philistines till later. So the tabernacle and the ark were separated by 120 years. So I would think that since the tabernacle was up there for like 400 years, they had probably built terraces and a whole shrine. And so there's still religious activity up there, maybe a school of the prophets, and there's still prophets of God. And this guy, Ahijah, comes down and he delivers a message. Has two parts to it. Number one, concerning the kingdom. 11:30 to 32, and then 35.
And Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe." Verse 35, I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes.
Wow. He's telling this guy Jeroboam, God is going to give him 10 tribes and he will become the king over those tribes. That's pretty heady stuff for a guy. And you'll notice in verse 33, he gives a little reasoning. He says, I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, Shemash, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites. That's Rehoboam's mother. Okay. In fact, Solomon, to placate his wives, had put temples to these foreign gods. You know where he put them? On the Mount of Olives. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Child sacrifice was made on the Mount of Olives. Where in the New Testament, that's where Jesus is. And that's where Jesus will return. Just an interesting thought. Anyway, that one tribe that was to be faithful to him was Judah. To be faithful to God and for the sake of David. But he says, I'm not going to do it during Solomon's life. So this guy goes to Egypt and he's waiting for Solomon to die. But then he says something that's interesting. 37:38.
However, as for you, I will take you and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and I will give Israel to you.
Sounds a lot like like God's warning to Solomon, doesn't it? Walk in my ways as my servant David did. Well, anyway, we get to chapter 12, and this is where the split actually occurs. Chapter 12, 1-4.
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you.
Interesting. This guy's been down in Egypt for years. We don't know how many, but he's been down there for a while, waiting for Solomon to die. And then when Solomon dies, he comes back. They make him their spokesman. Do you think he was active while he was down there? Oh, yeah. I think he was a lot like Lenin, who lived in Switzerland for many years. And he fostered all kinds of demonstrations against the Tsar. He wrote lots of publications. He did everything he could to undermine. And then at the right moment, he moved into the country. Actually, the Germans transported him into Moscow, and after the October Revolution in 1917, he took power and he got control. This is the kind of guy we're talking about. Powerful, charismatic, and he waits for his chance, and he gets the people to ask him. And he shows up before the king, right? And he's saying, let's see. He shows up before the king and he says, look, your father put a heavy yoke on us. Now lighten the harsh labor. Harsh labor from all that conscription. I imagine that as Solomon's projects grew, he just kept drafting more and more people. And people were tired of having their sons gone, doing this kind of slave labor. And then he had a heavy yoke. That would be taxation. You know, I took a course once in the Roman Empire. At the beginning of the Roman Empire, early in the Republic, when it was expanding faster than ever, the average citizen had to work 3 days to pay his tax. By the end of the empire, when it was falling apart, the average citizen worked half of his time to pay his tax. When's tax-free day? The end of May, right? And this professor was talking. He says it seems in history when a nation gets to the point where half of its income is devoted to the state, that things start to fall apart. Something for us to think about. Anyway, he says, I tell you what I want you to do. In verse 5, he says, give me 3 days, go away for 3 days, then come back to me. Why do you think he said that? Well, this is a big party. This is a huge celebration. He's been waiting for this for most of his life. He doesn't want this guy to interfere. He said, wait till the coronation's over. And he also wanted to get the crown on his head so he would speak from authority, right? And then he's looking for some advice. Now, First Kings 12, 6-8 tells us he asks the elders that served Solomon first. Go ahead, 12, 6-8.
Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him.
Anybody read Jim Collins' Good to Great? Who are the best leaders?
Servant.
Servant leaders. He calls them servant leadership or level 5 leaders, right? And these are the people who understand it is my job to serve the people that I lead. Not to be their boss, not to give the orders from on high. And that's true of our families. You know, there's a caricature of Christian marriage that says because the husband is the head of the wife, he's this tyrant who everybody has to obey to do whatever he asks. No, leadership's a lot more than that. His job is to sacrifice himself, provide what those he leads needs in love. Big difference. I think that's good advice. But then he goes to his young friends and he decides to ask them for his advice. These are the guys he grew up with. So in 12:10-11, beginning there, I think with my little finger.
My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions.
Oh, and that's what he actually used. He decided to go with them, kind of like Absalom went and he disregarded the advice of Ahithophel, David's counselor, and he went with his buddies and lost the kingdom. And Rehoboam does the same thing. What a foolish thing to say. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. You think you had it bad under him, it'll be much worse under me. Did he have the power to do that? No, he didn't. He didn't realize things were coming apart at the seams, and he could have headed off open revolution at very little cost. Just give him a little bit of break. Okay, but then what happens? Verse 16.
When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel. Look after your own house, O David. So the Israelites went home.
Now, I think that this would have been a little bit like the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Right? That was a nice, peaceful, easygoing assembly, wasn't it? Well, that was wild. This is a picture of it, stop the war. I think when the delegation led by Jeroboam came back, oh my, they gave the news of what Rehoboam had said. The people went nuts and they were angry and they're furious. They said, we're out of here. And they said, what have we to do with David? We're gone. And they all walked out. Now, this isn't a revolution. This wasn't a coup. There was no planning. There was nothing there to, if you were going to, execute a coup, you'd have some measure of armed force to kill the king. Probably take over the communication nodes, do all those sorts of things. None of that was there. They didn't know where they were going to go. They just wanted out. And so they all broke up. They're angry. They're fed up. The planning and the execution came a little bit later. We'll talk about that, especially next week. But now Rehoboam doesn't take it very seriously. I think his attitude is good riddance to bad rubbish. And so he tries to assert his control by sending his commissar, actually going with him, his commissar of labor, the guy in charge of all this forced labor, out to the local gangs of laborers. Now, maybe thousands of them, okay? And this guy goes out and he's going to give them orders for the day. And Rehoboam's right there with him to show him who's boss, right? And look what happens in verse 16. 12:16. Check.
When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them,
Oh, I'm sorry. Verse 18. Forgive me.
King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem.
Interesting. I want you to imagine this. The king with his little bodyguard, okay, a bunch of guys, and this labor official, he goes out there and he begins to give an address. And he talks about what a great day this is. We have a new king, one who will take us to new heights of glory. And you are part of his plan, his great... Whoa, what was that? People start boo, hiss. Wait a minute. This is our king. Boo. And then, stones. My God. And the people start to rush him. I mean, this is not nice and easy. The Bible stories are very nice and clean. And you try to fill in the gaps what really would have happened in a situation like that. And now the people are coming at him, pressing at him. And I think Rehoboam's bodyguard says, we're out of here. He grabs the guy, throws him in the chariot, and whips the horses and takes off. Poor Adonijah, he ends up being stoned to death. Now Rehoboam knows he's in trouble. What?
The only thing that can overcome that is power, because during the Chicago convention in 1968, that happened right in my neighborhood. And we were actually in a park, and they were throwing rocks and bottles and all kinds of things at the police and anybody who had any semblance of authority. And finally, what stopped it is Mayor Daley gave the order to shoot to kill. And that stopped the violence.
It'll do it.
Interesting enough.
Well, now that's a good point. So what does Rehoboam do?
He ran.
His bodyguard put him in that chariot and said, this is not safe for us anymore. And it must be a wonderful story if you really knew it. And they go up at a full gallop and they've got to make an escape from Shechem, which is way up in the north there among the northern tribes, past many perhaps hostile villages, didn't know who was loyal and who wasn't, and make it 50 miles down till he's safe in the fortress at Jerusalem. And when he gets there, the first thing he does is he starts putting together an army of 180,000 people. And it says in 12:21, check.
When Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered the whole house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 fighting men, to make war against the house of Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam, son of Solomon.
Yeah, now isn't that what you would do? All right, let's get back to the fortress. Let's call up the army. Now, 180,000 wasn't the biggest army, but it was a good enough army. Remember, he should have attacked immediately. He had the army under his control, all of the officer corps, all of the logistics. That Solomon had built that for him. It was there. And he was going to go out and get his kingdom back. But what happens? Well, the Lord intervenes. 22-24, Jack.
But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. Say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to the whole house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again as the Lord had ordered.
I have no idea why they obeyed and didn't go fight. They didn't seem to have much concern for God's opinion otherwise. But nevertheless, they decided not to, and they pulled back. Perhaps they feared the Lord going back to Moses' day, or perhaps he was paralyzed by fear. I also think that the Lord intervened to protect Jeroboam, and we'll talk about that next week. This wound up with civil war that lasted for Rehoboam and Jeroboam's lives, constantly shifting the border back and forth, until finally it was accepted that these are now two nations, not just one. So Rehoboam goes on and he rules for 17 more years. He actually seems to do good things. He fortifies 15 cities, builds up 15 cities, puts his son out there. He takes care of the succession. He anoints him the position of responsibility. And then he benefits from the things that Jeroboam is doing on the north. We'll talk about next week. But 2 Chronicles 11, 13 to 17 tells us something very interesting.
The priests and Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. And he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat and calf idols he had made. Those from every tribe of Israel who set their hearts on seeking the Lord, the God of Israel, followed the Levites to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to the Lord, the God of their fathers. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon, 3 years, walking in the ways of David and Solomon during this time.
So these people who were faithful to the Lord, Levites who lived in Levitical cities, priests, they had property, farms, everything, they left them and they came south to be faithful to God. It's a little bit like, the pilgrims, doesn't it? It sounds like people who are oppressed, are unable to worship the Lord, they leave, they vote with their feet. We may find some of us are going to be doing that someday. I don't know. But the effect on Rehoboam's country was good. And it said that they preserved the nation for about 3 years. And I think that 3 years was Rehoboam's chance. That was his chance to arrest the explosion of idolatry that was going on at the time. And he did not do any of that. He didn't foster idolatry so much as he tolerated it. And it says that after he became prosperous and he was settled in the throne, that he abandoned the law of the Lord completely. So that 3 years didn't give him much. It says again, the depravity of man. The need for leadership. The good leaders in Israel always tore down the idolatrous high places. They needed a righteous leader. God also will chastise his own. And here's what happens to Rehoboam's kingdom. Now, we're talking 5 years after Rehoboam becomes king, which is 25 years after the dedication of the temple and the palace of Solomon. And 2 Chronicles 12, 2 to 5 tells what happened.
Because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, with 1,200 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and the innumerable troops of Libyans, Sukkites, and Cushites that came with him from Egypt. He captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. Then the prophet Shemaiah came to Rehoboam and to the leaders of Judah who had assembled in Jerusalem for fear of Shishak, and he said to them, "This is what the Lord says, you have abandoned me, therefore I now abandon you to Shishak."
Wow. How would you like to have God say that to your nation? You've abandoned me. Okay, I'm going to abandon you. Does that not concern you? But when you look at the direction that our own country is taking, and the more you read history, you see how foundational the Bible is to all our institutions, to all of our customs, to our history. And that is being systematically destroyed, and we are turning to other gods, mostly to ourselves, And that doesn't bode well. You abandoned me, I will abandon you. Now, these Egyptians came up and they destroyed all of those fortresses. Isn't that interesting? Rehoboam invests all his money in building these fortified cities. Solomon married the Pharaoh's daughter and kept an alliance going. Rehoboam wasn't that smart. He didn't do anything to make peace with Egypt, and Egypt comes after him. And he destroys and lays waste all those cities. Think of how many people were killed, slaughtered, tortured, the cities that were burned. He's fortified 15 towns. Now, they come up to Jerusalem, and as they're about to destroy Jerusalem, he buys them off. And he does so by giving them all of the treasures of Solomon, everything from his palace, everything from the temple of the Lord. The temple isn't more than 25 years old. And if you remember, when I showed you the chart of all the kings, it was sacked like that 8 times. The glory really was gone, wasn't it? Solomon in his palace had a hallway lined with solid gold shields. It was a big matter of pride. And it says that Shishak took all of them and everything else that he could. Now, what happened after that? 2 Chronicles 12, 8-10 tells you something interesting.
They will, however, become subject to him so that they may learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of other lands. When Shishak king of Egypt attacked Jerusalem, he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shield Solomon had made. So King Rehoboam made bronze shields to replace them and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on duty at the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the Lord's temple, the guards went with him, bearing the shields, and afterward they returned them to the guard room.
Wow. I think that you'll find that the change in the shields is deeply symbolic of what happened to the nation. Solomon's glory was this hallway lined with gold, solid gold shields. And in his sin and the ripples that radiated out from that, he invited an alien foreign power to come in and take them away. And what Rehoboam did was he replaced them, not with gold, but with bronze. They're cheaper. And he put them in the guardhouse, just brought them out every now and then. It wasn't something to be terribly proud of. It wasn't something you lined your major hall with. I mean, we just put the bronze shields up there. Maybe we paint them gold. I don't know. That's symbolic. When a leader and a king leads a nation away from the Lord, then the Lord abandons them to this kind of trouble, and he causes 3 things to happen. He brings great damage on the nation. Think about that. All those 15 fortified cities were reduced to rubble. Think of the people who lived there. Think of the soldiers who had to defend it, who were killed and destroyed. All of that was because they rejected the Lord. And the riches that God has given us, God can take away, right? Deuteronomy says that it is he said, beware when you have great farms and great crops and you are wealthy, because it is I who give you the power to make wealth, not yourself. When you say that my hand has delivered me, I have generated all this wealth, be careful, because I can take what I've given you. Secondly, servitude. And remember, up to now, Solomon has been receiving tribute or taxes from all the nations, all the way from the Euphrates down to Egypt, Ammon, Moab, Assyria, or Aram, and even some of the countries next to Egypt. He's been receiving tribute. Now he's got to pay it. Now he is going to be paying the price year after year after year. And it says in there, so that he will learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of other lands. And then thirdly, the glory is lost. The gold shields of Solomon's glory turned to bronze in 5 years. One thinks of the word Ichabod. Ichabod was the name that one of the daughter-in-laws of Eli named her son when the ark was captured. She says, the glory is gone. Glory is gone. Up to now, Rehoboam probably thought he could wage war on the north. He could reclaim his kingdom, once again be as glorious as his father, but not anymore. At this point, it becomes obvious his kingdom is lost, and he will settle for the remnants. And I want to suggest that this is a metaphor or a pattern for us. When we choose to walk away from God, when we serve other gods, and we do this by not setting our hearts on the Lord, by not listening to his rules and laws, by living lives that are just neglectful of him, saying we can go our own way, we can do our own thing, then we will cause damage to ourselves, but more importantly, we'll cause it to a lot of other people. And I think, Solomon was enticed away because of his weakness for women and romance. He took wives that turned his heart to other gods. That then translates to his son. His son loses all the wealth that Solomon had built up and all the death and destruction that came from it. What you and I do when we choose to serve other gods, I don't care if it's money, love, sex, children, politics, whatever it is, anything that we place before the living God will result in damage to us and damage to a whole bunch of people beyond us. And it will also put us in servitude. You are servants of the one you yield yourselves to obey, Romans says. When we yield ourselves to obey sin, we become its servants. It's been said that the devil will take you deeper than you want to go, keep you there longer than you want to stay, and cost you a whole lot more than you have. And the glory that we all want in life is gone. How many of us will look back on our lives and we were young, ambitious. We thought we'd have all these wonderful things. We would do such great things. Even as Christians, we wanted to do great things for God. And there are times when we yielded to our own weak spots and Satan got a hold of us. And he pulled us away and he caused us damage. And he caused damage to our loved ones, especially our children. And he put us in servitude. And we can't pay it off. We can't get the glory back because we were made for that glory. We were made for fellowship with the creator of the universe. We long for Eden. And we can't get there from here. That's kind of a hopeless thought, isn't it? Except that's where the gospel comes in. You see, we were watching a show last night, and the chief inspector on Shetland is bearing this terrible burden of these murders that have occurred, and he's trying to solve them, and he can't keep people from getting killed, and it's just killing him. And he's having a dinner with a woman that's a friend of his. They're maybe starting a romance, we don't know. But she looks at him, she says, "Boy, you look awful. You're wearing this. Listen, you are not to blame for these murders." But he said, I am. I've got to make this right. It's my problem. And she says, "I don't know if I want to have much to do with you. You are like the sin eater." He said, "What's a sin eater?" She said, "It's an Irish custom that at an Irish funeral, there is a fellow who comes and in the presence of the body, a long time ago, would eat a meal. And when he does that, he's taking on himself, the sins of the person in the coffin so that that person's spirit can go to heaven." And she says, "Jimmy, you can't eat it all. You haven't got what it takes to bear that burden. And this is a secular show, and I'm sitting there saying, that'll preach, because there is someone who can eat that sin. There is someone who has borne the sin for us. That's the gospel. That's the glory that God has given to us. And it's the lesson, I think, of Rehoboam. He's a tragic figure, but he's not a tragic figure apart from his father. And it's a tragic pattern. It's not just the pattern of that ancient kingdom. It's not the pattern of every kingdom. It's not even the pattern just of our families or ourselves. These things happen constantly. It's the pattern of the human race. We all serve other gods, and we need a sin eater. And that sin eater is Jesus.